This is a bit of a strange video, but today we're considering what would happen if the Entity's realm came to a sudden halt and the survivors and killers all decided to stop. As a kind of theory, kind of lore related video, this is a slightly unrealistic scenario as some of the killers like Myers probably don't want to stop murdering, but a lot of the killers definitely would. So, everything stops. Survivors stop running, killers stop killing. Now what? Well, it's probably not that simple. As hope and emotion is the Entity's source of sustenance, the sudden stop in the trials would be the equivalent of starving the Entity. Now, I've seen the argument that the Entity would just toss out the survivors and killers and get a refresh of the realm with new survivors and killers who are easier to control and are unaware of what is happening. I don't think this would be the case though, because, well, from the best of our knowledge, the Entity only has a total of 48 people, or 47 people and demo, meaning there's already a limited amount. If he just needed hope, surely he would just pick as many as he can. This doesn't mean that this is the real total number of people in the realm, as there's other people in the realm too, such as Benedict Baker or the Observer, who could be the same person, but others like Vigo or Alex within the lore are pretty unexplained, but do seem to have existed or currently exist somewhere within the realm. There are a few more than these base few that come in the form of probably survivors, as their names appear on base survivor perks, which are the names Azayu, Clyde, Donna, Dylan, Murph, Nikki, Sassy, and Sujin. We know from our out-of-lore perspective that these are names of community moderators put into the game as an Easter egg, but what they also function as is a reminder that what we see in-game, as in our survivor and killer rosters, is potentially just the tip of the iceberg for the true number of people who are in the Entity's realm. Further, the fact that these names we see appear in the flavor text of certain perks are from something called the Lost Tapes. We can assume that potentially these people lore-wise are not around anymore, or at least are lost, and potentially already have been discarded by the Entity, which would also suggest that to the Entity, everyone inside of its realm is not that valuable, and also there has been previous refreshes in the survivors of the realm at the very least. To the best of our knowledge, the survivors available out of our roster are the only ones here though, and whenever a new survivor is added, it's as a result of the Entity taking them, meaning the order we see the survivors release in is probably the order in which they are taken, because obviously time isn't really linear when it comes to the Entity's realm. It's technically all occurring in the year 1896, which obviously most of the survivors weren't taken in. This suggests that the Entity does handpick the survivors pretty carefully, and it needs a certain type of person for its realm to function to its full potential. This is why it typically picks people subjected largely to trauma or those who lack an identity of some form, both killers and survivors alike. My point being, if the Entity were to pluck some random off the street, that random person would likely have their full potential of hope drained far too quickly, which is why the Entity handpicks them and makes sure it is obtaining prime subjects to feed on effectively. Everyone in the realm is unique in that way. Further, bear in mind that these are the 48 across the entirety of a multiverse. A multiverse is potentially infinite possibilities of things, so our roster of characters are likely unique to a certain world from the multiverse and cannot be found elsewhere, as that worldly version of them is the perfect outcome for what the Entity needs. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think that our characters can simply be flushed out and replaced. Otherwise, surely after more are added, some of the less effective ones would be removed, right? But they haven't been, which means they must still be an effective source of food and energy for the Entity, more so also than just any old person or respectively killer that the Entity could pull off the street. Thinking about the people elsewhere in the realm, we know that the Observer is somewhere that the Entity can't reach, but due to having his Aurus, he can still look into the Entity and its fog. So we know that within the Entity's realm, there's also other realms or areas, these being the spirit world, the ethereal plane, and the dream world, the void, the upside down, and the campfire. So apparently the campfire is actually a completely different section to the Entity's realm itself, but still inside of it, which as we see in game is for when the survivors are awaiting a trial, yet also presumably where killers prepare for a trial, as in the campfire lobby, we see the killer onlooking onto 4 survivors. The campfire almost like the waiting lounge for the survivors and killers just before a trial. Overall though, my point being is that we only ever see 5 characters in a certain area at any given time, unless you make exceptions for characters like the twins who are really 2 people, so this would make some kind of revolt pretty hard to happen because you can't really communicate with one another beyond these set groups of 5 at a time. The survivors already being in a group and sat around the campfire would have a better chance to organize an uprising, but for killers they're only going to get the chance to communicate with the survivors and not another killer. This means the entity in the context of the lore has actually thought this out pretty well to ensure any uprising or revolts from happening. Also, from the best of our understanding, the survivors and killers can't speak, which would be why they use actions and such within the game. This may just be seen like a game mechanic, but if you watch them around the campfire, they don't talk. They don't talk when running around in trials, when honestly coordination would be very helpful. Even the characters who do talk, like Ash, don't talk during the trials, meaning maybe he's capable of defying the entity by just speaking somewhat, but he isn't capable of doing so when actually in the trials. And again, this could be because it would potentially result in an uprising and a stop to the trials. The fact the survivors only have 2 actions and don't talk is pretty weird, right? Even if they didn't know each other from outside the entity's realm, in a situation like the trials you would communicate with those around you if given the chance. Obviously, lore-wise, they aren't all in a Discord call or an Xbox Live party, so they must not be able to communicate and have been restricted to their speech and noises to simply grunts of pain or sounds when falling from high structures and such. The same mostly for killers, with grunts when swinging their weapons or when a pallet is dropped on them. These are all things that are required to help the entity feed on hope and emotion. The grunts are needed to motivate the killers, and the frustration of their failure is needed to drive them. So all of this lack of communication is going to make starting a revolution very hard if verbal communication is off the cards, aside Ash occasionally spitting out some questionable comments. However, this doesn't mean it would be impossible to coordinate something. I mean, the survivors can be coordinated enough to complete 5 spread out generators, unhook each other and escape, so it really isn't so far-fetched that they could organize some sort of revolt. We also know that the survivors don't always come in the same groups, and also that there can be multiple of the same person. Again, you could argue that this is just from a gameplay perspective, but we can see it within the game. It's almost like the entity is testing something, like the perfect combination of killer and survivors. I don't know, my point being that the survivors would all overlap with one another enough to be able to pass along the information between them and potentially manage to convince the killers to stop also. However, they would have to convince each killer individually, and each killer would not be able to communicate with the other killers, so all the coordination is basically down to the survivors entirely. This means, especially in the cases of Demogorgon or Pyramid Head, who we're not even sure if they understand English or not, it's going to be hard to face up to them mid-trial and actually try and stop them from slashing away at them. So, theoretically, would an uprising be possible? Yes. Yeah, I think so, but I think managing to coordinate it and convince everyone is not very likely, and further attempting to gain the help of the Observer in another plane is going to be hard, as the survivors likely don't even know he exists. Potentially they get some kind of feeling when he interacts with their memories, but there's no indication that this is the case, so really we're just speculating. Realistically, I would say that the Observer is their best option for actually escaping and leaving the realm somehow. Although he doesn't seem to know, and he hasn't left himself, so maybe not. And other survivors within the realm like Benedict Baker have seemingly broken the loop of trials and regained and overcome the repeat memory loss that a survivor suffers from trial to trial. But again, he hasn't escaped either, so overall it doesn't seem too possible. However, they're single cases, and they're not a collective. Other than him, I would imagine Blight is their next best bet, as he harnesses what is effectively a pathogen that seems to take over the realm itself. But again, Blight probably isn't going to be swayed by 4 survivors collectively pointing at him as he begs the entity for more cankers as a reward for his killing. You'll know if you watched the 2 videos about beating the killers and beating the entity that we constructed 2 dream teams, one made up of survivors and one made up of killers. For the Survivor one, the final remaining survivors we outlined as capable of beating killers and potentially the entity were Cheryl, Ash, David, Yui, Bill, Feng, and Jake. For the killers, we came down to a team of Myers, Pyramid Head, Demogorgon, Blight, Deathslinger, and Hag. The killers out of all of these people are definitely going to be the more capable ones in helping, as most of them have some kind of power or supernatural element. What I want to propose is basically an escape plan for the survivors and killers on how they could enact a stoppage or a takeover of the realm. in an attempt to shut it down primarily with use of the Dream Team characters that we've previously outlined, as they're the most likely ones to not only take action, but have a useful skill set to provide for taking the entity down. So, first off, we would need Cheryl, Ash, David, and Yui together to enter a trial and likely face the most reasonable killer out of the Dream Team, the Deathslinger. The Deathslinger being an intelligent person who would likely consider and stop what he was doing if he thought there was something broader going on and he could see he was being controlled. So our 4 survivors either formulate a method of communication with use of some kind of system of nods, points, and come heres. Potentially they could point at different objects within the trials, or point out specific words found on posters or newspaper articles on the walls, and get the Slinger to stop and read them himself. Presumably he can read some form of English at least. Because although none of them can speak, they aren't stupid and can clearly retain the majority of their human function. Just by the fact that the survivors have strategy and the killers can intelligently use their power, the entity has seemingly only stripped the communicative capability of them. So, they get Slinger on board after explaining through pointing at words on posters or newspapers scattered around the maps. As the trials continue, in his free time and during the yearly Hallowed Blight event, Slinger constructs a blighted weapon, likely some kind of spear blight rifle thing, and he gives it to the survivors, probably safest with Cheryl. From here, the survivors utilize this to threaten different killers, starting with Blight. So after the event ends and the realm has been cleansed, which by the way would be a great distraction for the survivors and killers to uprise, and plot would be during its yearly time when it needs to cleanse the realm of this pathogen that infects it. So they use the blighted gun to win over the blight, and become supplied with more serum capable of creating more weapons. Further, this serum that can buff the survivors themselves to the equal strength of the blight. They all inject and they all become stronger. A lot like the killers appear to be when it's injected into them, as seen in their blighted skins. It might mess them up a bit, but they will be resistant and stronger physically. From here, the beefed up survivors stop the most powerful killers such as Executioner and Myers, and with a supply of blighted serum and specially constructed weaponry, our Dream Team forms, using their combined skills and maybe some help from our realm-shattering characters like Nurse, Freddy, or Demo to break them into another plane with use of the Blight, which can seemingly directly affect the realm. Here they can gather together in higher numbers than 5, where the entity can't reach them and where they can make a plan, possibly with the Observer's help to help them escape. So yeah, that's the idea. That would be pretty cool, huh? Let me know how you think the survivors and killers could possibly team up to overcome the entity itself. Maybe with this scenario I could do a 1v1 style video for the Dream Team versus the entity. I do hope you enjoyed though. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. An additional thank you to LHPL3 as well as my other members for supporting the channel.